Well, this is the mini lecture, second mini lecture for our course in Haters and Grace. And it's obvious by now that the undergirding of this course that you have from me is on the examination of violence is a feminist critical theory. Okay, so I'm influenced by Serene Jones, Elizabeth Schussler Farienza, Rosemary Radford Ruther, but then again, Tracy West, Kwok Pulan, and Evelyn Parker. But that's what I'm operating out of. And it's mostly white women's feminist, with the exception of bringing in the womanist perspective. That is, mostly white women's feminism that's privileged in society. That doesn't mean that there are not other perspectives that are lenses through which we could see this issue or ought to. But I believe that feminist critical theory confronts violence, not just to violence to women and girls, but all kinds of violence in a way that offers some radical activist solutions. It's not that women or feminists are less violent, but that women's experience of loss, war, domestic violence, misogyny, bring some critical interrogation, and elimination of violence in our society that we ought to look at. And I want to add that gender violence is not just directed at women. As I define in the book that I edited, Female Child Soldiering, it includes the rape, sexual assault, intimate partner violence in heterosexual, homosexual, same-sex partnerships, sexual harassment, stalking, prostitution, and sex trafficking. There's a spectrum. And it's increasing. The women are disproportionately harmed by gender-based violence. The United Nations Population Fund poll puts it at 1 in 3 women have experienced physical or sexualized violence in their lives. That doesn't include emotional or verbal abuse. But I want to stop here and just take care that, this is not male bashing. We're not assuming that it's all at the hands of males. I know many men who have experienced gender violence. And I know many men who would never disrespect or harm intentionally. Many men who abhor the violence done to women. But we have a culture where it's normal for a woman to walk down the street and have men make sexual comments, or normal for men to prey on women. And there's the issue of consent. You can always say it was consensual. But what the question is, what constitutes consent in a relationship? Yes, I want to be with you, genuine versus coerced or manipulated consent. Now, I should say that feminist theory has been critiqued by women of color who call out the privilege of white women like myself who have done most of the talking. Cheryl Kirk Duggan and Tracy West are women scholars who start from the position of intersectionality of gender and race and sexual orientation and bring that to the discussion. Intersectionality is a term that was coined, I think, going back to 1989, late 80s, by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with another, and develop and overlap. So these multiple experiences add to the sense of difference. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. But for some, it led to backlash from the far right, who started saying that intersectionality was just a term for those who for deciding who's more oppressed than the other. Like, a hierarchy of who's more oppressed than the other. For conservatives, intersectionality meant because you're a minority, you get special treatment, special standards. It's a reverse discrimination kind of thing. You get, because of your intersectionality, you're more oppressed than I am. But but instead of dividing minorities, the kind of concept or beauty of intersectionality is that it's made us more determined to claim these multiple identities and differences and their beauty. So I'm going to post a link on Brightspace from Baylor University, which is a Baptist institution, on the beauty of intersectionality. And I'm going to also send you a link on a TED Talk from Kimberly Crenshaw herself talking about it. And very interestingly, this is a sort of aside, she lists the name, so she has everybody in the audience stand up. And she says, she lists the names of African Americans who have been killed by police within the past few years. And she says, when you don't recognize the name of this person, sit down. So everybody's standing up. And she says, sit down when you hear a name you don't recognize. And she lists the people, and then people begin to sit down. And, interestingly, she got down to she listed the names, and the names that left the most people standing were females. The names of the men who were more prominent in the news, only 4 people were left standing who knew the names of women. So I hope you'll listen to her talk. I think it's interesting. But as you know, I edited a book that's part of our reading on female child soldiering. I took that on because of a challenge of a former student and friend. And that whole thing has led me to teach on this. Not because I promote the book or whatever, but I just said, let's just keep this conversation going. So I was reluctant to write the book or to edit the book because I thought people might say, what's a privileged white American woman talking about something like that? And they still might say that. They probably do. It's not part of my personal experience, but then or is it? Or is it? So I thought I would get a conversation going between women of different perspectives to contribute to let's call it transnational solidarity. Transnational solidarity. To critique the values, the norms that perpetuate forms of exploitation and violence. As Tracy West says, the goal of meaningfully contributing to an approach aimed at stopping the practice of gender violence demands unflinching, I love that word, unflinching scrutiny of our own starting assumptions about how we, in fact, allow and support values that lead to violence against children and women. I don't want to repeat what you've already read in the book, but just to recap what I think is a key premise. In my opening chapter, I utilize Amy Allen's discussion of theories of power. She critiques the understanding of power as a resource that some people can have and others don't, assuming power is a commodity that can be distributed or used up. But this assumes a power over relationship. Someone or group has more power than another. The balance of power, then, in that case, may be ever shifting. But in the case of power relations and gender difference is described as men having most of the power. The solution to that for some is to eliminate binary constructions of gender. So there's no longer male nor female, and isn't that in the Bible, right? But our people no longer identify as male or female exclusively, binary. So we eliminate gender. However, that may constitute the folding in of female or feminine into male-dominated ways of being or looking or presenting. So Allen also critiques another understanding of power as empowerment, which is where I've come from for most of my life. Empowering women, which, is described as there are feminine traits or qualities that have been devalued or diminished and ought to be lifted up. But in harnessing and empowering women, those traits, those exact traits, will transform systems of domination and power. Yet, empowerment theory looks to some like a little essentialist. Like, women have essential qualities, men have essential qualities. So, anyway, Amy Allen argues for a power with understanding of power, to resist, and rather than resistance taking the form of power over, it is a solidarity of power with, the power to act, to change, to bring a measure of force or pressure. And we talked about this in terms of confrontation, to resist. Now, talking about solidarity, the power with, the power to, has fallen out of favor in recent years because of, it seems to fail to, because we don't know how to talk about it, about difference. it seems disingenuous. It seems to like a false solidarity. Um, like to some it meant I have to look like or do like you or take up your identity in the cause of solidarity. It was a kind of false allyship, you know. And so, but the term, and also the term solidarity with the poor came to mean charity work, or, I'm going to stoop myself to, go with the people and end up with the people, and in order to lift you up or to rescue you, as a kind of, so that's was the critique of how solidarity kind of fell out of favor. It was disingenuous. Anyway, however, Tracy West, who we're reading, is reclaiming that word, that terminology, and she has a new book out that wasn't quite ready for this course, but it's called Solidarity and Defiant Spirituality. Now, Tracy traveled to Ghana and South Africa and Brazil, all over, to interview activists involved in the struggle against gender violence in those places. And in each of those places, as in North America, Christianity and anti-black or anti-color racism have been implicated in violence against women. So she calls attention to forms of violence in North America and international settings, such as marital rape, sex trafficking of women and girls, domestic violence, targeting of lesbians, and we'll look at genital mutilation. We'll look at that a little bit later. But her book offers an expansive and nuanced view, I think, of how we form a kind of activist solidarity in tackling or dismantling this violence using what we know, what she calls, and what is a feminist critical theory notion of resistance theory. So resistance theory promotes a politicized reading of the actions taken to oppose power hierarchies that reinforce systemic inequalities related to class, gender, race, sexuality, sexual orientation, and it relates to the dismantling of the disimagination machine that critical pedagogy talks about, that we read from Mayan Tron. So I see it as being applied to the situation of Indigenous women in Canada who were murdered and depicted in the documentary Highway of Tears. And so I want us to sort of think about that and see where that relates. And the other day I mentioned a book on women and gendered violence in Canada, and I'm looking at that, and there's examples in Canada about the tropes of female gender and ways in which society subtly has constructed and taught the inferiority of the female. Now, in the early days of my ministry, I counseled a woman who was in a domestic violence situation, and I kept begging her to leave. I offered her shelter in my own home. I became completely frustrated that she didn't leave. But then I learned that was putting her in more jeopardy. That could have been putting her in more jeopardy. It's to blame the victim. And the better question is, what can we do to get the perpetrator to let her go? He was to blame. He was the toxin. The problem is not that she didn't leave. The problem was that he exercised his power over her not to let her, to keep her in the trap, to cause her fear of her own life. Power that he had been somehow taught was rightfully his. I was so afraid for her, and I couldn't fix it. She coped by withdrawing, hiding, finding excuses to needed to be someplace else, but any other strategy that she could get to work. But finally, he was the one to leave, because he did leave. I think he was looking for another victim. One was not so far along in her ability to resist. Now, while we don't want to downplay the stories of victims of violence, victimhood raises important moral questions. Tracy West prefers the term victim survivors. I like that term, victim survivors, because victims are also agents. Victims are also resistors. Yes, victims are hurt, harmed, and sometimes in seemingly irreparable ways. But don't assume that victims are weak. Because resisting takes many forms. As Tracy West says, any act of dissent is resisting. Confrontation is resisting. Silence can be resisting. Closing the door can be resisting. Surviving is resisting. I want to call your attention to a book written by Jennifer Ayers entitled Waiting for a Glacier to Move. Subtitle, Practicing Social Witness. Yes, glaciers are slow, but they do move. And pushing against a glacier, if you will, is an act of power, an act of resistance that we are called to do. Amen.